Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is LEGENDS. It's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more now through November 19th. Noble Knight has all your RPG back-to-school needs. One-stop shop, and whether it's board games, magic cards, books, dice, whatever it may be, Noble Knight is the place to be. Using the code LEGENDS, good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through November 19th, you can set yourself up pretty pre-holidays with everything you need to run some games for your friends and your family. So next time you're checking out at Noble Knight Games, don't forget to use the code LEGENDS. Good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through November 19th. From our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Tonight, we're going to talk about items and things that I would never allow into my home, but he will, Stu Horvath.
It's very true. It's very true.
It's funny because when I hit you up today, I'm like, what are we going to do the show on tonight? You're like, we're going to talk about black magic. And I didn't really think about it. You know, it's a holiday weekend. I wasn't really thinking about it. But, you know, I jump in the Google machine today and I'm like looking around. I was like, well, black magic is a pretty broad spectrum of things. But lo and behold, you actually want to talk about black magic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a specter that's haunted role-playing games since the late 70s, right? So,
You're not wrong.
I want to speak about one specific piece of black magic, the Goetia, which is a collection of invocations for 72 demons and their little seals. Each one has a magic circle that has their name on it and sort of like a strange pattern. And all of these things have sort of permeated pop culture in a way that's sort of interesting to me. They touch on, you know, role-playing games as well. Cultism in general is kind of interesting to me just because, like, it's all kind of obviously made up. The more that you kind of dig into specifically European ritual magic, it all sort of comes from this source of the middle of the Renaissance, and people were just kind of making stuff up. Some of the famous grimoires, like the Red Dragon, you think of them as like medieval texts, books of black magic that witches were getting burned for, right? But the Red Dragon is actually like not that long, and it was probably written in maybe the late 1700s. You find historically that these things are neither nearly as old as you think, nor do they have any kind of like older root that you can kind of start to pinpoint specific origin points for most of like the famous books of magic that are out there historically in the West. And the Goetia is sort of one of the most famous. It's part of a larger work called the Lemegeton, which is also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. This is sort of one of the backbones of Western occultism. And this one actually does kind of go back kind of far. This sort of emerges in the 1500s, right? And people kind of like see this and they're interested in it. There's something about it that kind of catches people's imagination. So like you see variants of it over the next couple centuries. The main one that I think sort of like solidifies this one's place in pop culture is the Dictionary Infernal by Colin de Plancie. The third edition of this in like 1865 or whatever has illustrations by someone named Louis Le Breton. And they are fantastic. You've seen them. You just don't realize what they are. They look very much like the original Alice in Wonderland illustration, that sort of delicate pen work, you know, cross-hatched etching kind of thing.
Right.
But then they're all these horrible demons, but they're not actually that horrible. Usually it's like a dude with some random animal head. It's like a guy with a bow. I was like, what? But they're fantastic. And you've definitely seen them. Like my favorite is Andres, who is a baron of hell. And he's usually pictured as like a dude with a sword. I think the Breton, he has like wings and like an owl head. And he just looks cool. And he's like really into murder, you know?
A murder owl?
Yeah, murder owl. And the idea is that you can call up any of these particular demons. There's 72 of them, and they each have like their own sort of spheres of influence. Like one can teach you how to become invisible. The other one can teach you to find buried treasure. The one can, kill an enemy or make somebody sick or make somebody fall in love with you, and all these different like things. And you call up specific ones, and it's all super dangerous because like you have like a magic circle and you have to do it right. And it's a grueling ceremony with all this kind of occult stuff that you need to make for the ceremony and do it right. And if you screw it up, the demon's going to grab you and bring you down to hell, and that's the end of you. The Breton illustrations sort of like just sell this. The famous one is Asmodeus, and he's like this triple-headed monster frog demon thing. It looks kind of comical, kind of horrible at the same time, but like they kind of vibrate in this way that I think there's something about them that kind of taps into some sort of like deeper symbolic way that we think about stuff that's almost magical, right? Not too dissimilar from Carl Jung's archetypes, like in dreams and stuff. And this is sort of the way that they kind of filter through into the modern era. You see them like this is very much the subject of Peter Straub's novel, The Dark Matter. A Dark Song is sort of an adjacent sort of horror movie that's ritual magic, but it involves the Book of Abramelin, which is sort of like a different kind of thing, and Guardian Angels. But like it's like the same kind of vibe. Hereditary, King Paimon in Hereditary is one of the Goetia demons. All of these things sort of like become symbols for like, I don't know, human unconsciousness aspects of it and the manipulation of them. And that's how they kind of get applied in horror stories and other stuff. And it's also in role-playing games. The subject of the podcast, role-playing games, not spooky occult crap.
Bring it back around, Stu.
From the Goetia, you get this notion of an organized hierarchy of devils and demons in hell, the idea of dukes and presidents and kings of demons. And Gary Gygax just basically uses the lists from the Goetia in the Monster Manual 2 in 1983. It's like right there under devils. So one of the things that is a constant theme when you read the thing is that it's like King Baal, he's like cool dude, dresses well, and controls like 40 infernal legions. And basically Gygax maintains that kind of phraseology. There's a chart. It's called the Hierarchy of the Blades of Hell, and it lists all the dukes, which, is one of the main taxonomies of the Goetia. And it's just like Abingor is in the service of Beelzebul. He commands 60 companies of Malebranche. This whole list, and really Gygax's conception of hell springs directly out of the Goetia, right?
Unsurprising. I mean, we knew just from Appendix N that Gary Gygax was well read.
Yeah.
And like, I love it in a lot of ways because in essence, these were the first real monster manuals made up how many years ago? So they're definitely public domain, so he could totally use it, easy peasy. That being said, it's very interesting to think about, back then, everybody was a mark. And the weather is not going the way you wanted to go. Oh my God, God has turned against us, or whatever you're going to immediately go to. Because, look, back in the day, they didn't have Doppler radar. So how were they to know what was coming around the corner? Like if you prayed to your deity and then suddenly, you got rain on your crops, it was like, oh, see, we did it. It's the proof. But if you do it and they don't get back to you immediately, and then you're going to have like a drought for another 2 weeks, then you haven't been faithful enough. So I can totally see where the concept of magic really works back so many, many, many years ago, because prove that it doesn't, right?
Yeah. Like everybody talks about how Jack Vance sort of is the fundamental magical system of D&D, but this also really informs it. And just the idea, the greater, broader sort of European magical thinking is infused in D&D's magic systems, definitely in the approach to the infernal, the fiends, like the gate spell, protection from evil. Those things are rooted in magic, like occult magic. But it's weird. So it's kind of ironic, right? That like people were really upset with the satanic panic and stuff, but nobody actually mentioned the Goetia. Partly because like we all know that like it wasn't a serious thing. There's an argument to be made here if you think that D&D is evil, and yet those folks didn't really make it, Well,
it was really just a surface argument because look, in the end of the day, D&D books are all long and have been since Christ left Pittsburgh. So anyone who got their underpants in a bunch during the Satanic Panic was just look, oh my God, that's a picture of a demon. But they weren't reading all the way to the back to seeing like what actual ritual casting is on these spells where you need like, wing of bat, lint from the belly button of a dwarf, and maybe some sand from your local beach to cast this spell. Like that's something that I immediately took away from it when I first got into D&D, which was, one thing that I have never made any of my players do as a dungeon master was like, oh, most of these spells to cast them as a spellcaster, you need these actual ritual components, which like takes the whole idea of evil and Satanism and all this other stuff to a whole new level. Thank God it was in the back of the book, or maybe they would have figured out a way to make the Satanic Panic stick, right?
Right. And the spell components and stuff, that's another thing that sort of comes out of like this idea of complexity of doing it right, of having particular details that have to be followed to the letter, right? The Abramelin working, which is a fantastic horror movie, A Dark Song is sort of based on it. The ritual, the actual ritual that's detailed in this book is supposed to take 18 months.
What?
Yeah. That's the beauty of these sort of old occult books is like they put these details in that were ridiculous. No one has the time or money to be able to sequester themselves for 18 months of like rituals. You're automatically like removing the ability of 95% of the human population from being able to test this really powerful magical ritual. You know what I mean? Like it's very clever like that.
Yeah, it really is. But in the same breath, it makes a lot of sense because let's look at a movie like The Gate back in the day. Like, what did they do? They like lit a candle, backwards. Played a record backwards, and then suddenly the demon comes up. Like if you're looking like back in like in the medieval times and whatever, where it would take like 2 months to send a letter from like one fiefdom to another, it should take 18 months to call up a demon from hell because like you don't even have like messenger pigeons at this point. It should take a little while to get the pizza delivered, right?
Yeah, no, so you're right.
It makes total sense to me. And actually like it feels a lot more powerful because like, when you see stuff like this in movies and TV shows, it really just seems like any like Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, or like Joe can like say, oh, I'm going to take some chalk. I'm going to draw this thing on the floor, scribbly bibbly. I'm going to say these words backwards. And then suddenly Azazel's here.
Yeah.
You rang, sir? No. 18 months seems a little more realistic.
Yeah. And that's one of the beautiful things about A Dark Song, which if you haven't seen that, Hambone Man, you like a good horror movie. It's a good one. But the things is like, yeah, the Abramelin is supposed to be 18 months. The movie sort of fictionalizes that and says, well, you're going to be stuck in this house together for a month. And that's still a really long time, like a really grueling kind of thing that these two characters go through. But it gives everything a weight. And, I love the idea of like the John Constantine kind of style of street magic, where you can kind of just like make it up as you go along. But there's definitely something to be said for like the grandness of the big rituals. You know what I mean?
You know what I just realized, Stu? A lot of people took the time we've been indoors for the pandemic and they learned to do things like bake bread. And got Pelotons. Like, what if at the beginning of this whole thing, they were like, you know what I'm going to do with this time when I'm in exile from the world, waiting for this whole thing to blow over? They could have been learning to summon a demon the entire time. And by the time they finally get to leave their houses, they got a demon, bro.
That's true. I mean, at the end of the Armadale, you're supposed to have like your holy guardian angel hanging out with you.
America, we did it wrong. Maybe.
We didn't have to talk about ritual magic to talk about how we did it wrong, but
you know what? I'm glad y'all bake bread. Maybe that was the better and safer choice.
Probably, honestly. But there's a deeper irony here, too, which I have to get into. So one of the most famous things about occultism and magic written in Western civilization is Cornelius Agrippa wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy. He published that in 1533. So we're talking almost 500 years ago. Okay. And it's this gigantic treatise of just collecting all sorts of occult and magical knowledge. There were some people at the time who were really upset about this. The Inquisition definitely didn't want it to be published, and he got into some professional problems. But he was a man of science. He was a naturalist, a doctor. He was not actually like a magician, although he did have a certain reputation for magic. But if you read the books, they're fascinating because they're a collection of lore that he really doesn't believe. He's constantly kind of like presenting it with his tongue firmly in cheek and kind of like calling BS on most of it. It's interesting to me that like it's a foundational magical book. Like people, occultists today still kind of refer to it, but he's taking the piss the entire time. Now, one of his students is Johann Weyer, and he doesn't even have fun with it. He puts together a book called, now forgive me, I took 4 years of Latin in high school, but I wasn't really good at it. So let's see how we do here. De prestigiis demonum et incantionibus ac veneficis, which means on the illusions of the demons and on spells and poisons. It's basically a big book presenting most of the same stuff that his teacher Agrippa kind of presented, and just totally trying to disprove it. Not even a hint of like having fun with it, no tongue in cheek, just calling BS on it explicitly. And in the appendix to this book is what's called the Pseudo-Monarchy of Demonum, which is a list of 72 demons. He presents this list as just like, here, look at this. It's a compilation of every demon I can find and their supposed, abilities. And the Pseudo-Monarchy of Demonium translates to false kingdom of the demons or false hierarchy. He gives a dukes and president, all of this stuff. The whole idea here is to make an object lesson of how ridiculous this looks when you put it on paper and take it all in at the same time. This is the book that they ripped off to make the Ars Goetia. The people who made the Lesser Key used Weyer's book where he's just like, this is all nonsense, and took it seriously and repurposed it into a book of black magic. And I think that that's amazing.
That is amazing because he sounds like the original exposurist, which for those listening at home, that's what they call people who go around and reveal the way magicians do their tricks and illusions. So it really does sound like he was like, no, guys, it's all crap. I wrote it all down in this book. And I do think that's amazing. I agree with you that they took it and they ran with it, and they actually were like, well, I mean, granted, like there's no way to do real research back then. There's no Wikipedia. So it's like, oh, wait, the list is all right here. We'll just copy that shit and we're going to make it real.
Yeah, the reason that you can tell is apparently there's a typo or one of the demons is left out. He leaves it out, and then somebody sort of reprints it and leaves it out. And then all of a sudden, the Goetia comes out a couple years later and it doesn't have that demon in it at all. And that's sort of like the way you can kind of see that, like, oh, well, the Pseudo-Monarchum, that's the one that came first. And it's just such like this great, like the Amazing Randy back in 1500, But then imagine if the Amazing Randy's career was all like turned inside out and became like the fodder for like some crank religion, right?
Oh, I love it. I love it in so many different ways. Well, Stu, for me, I grew up in a household that really did not enjoy things like the idea of Satan. However, my grandmother, she did have psychic abilities, and that's why like I've learned a healthy fear and respect of things like tarot cards and Ouija boards. Not even once. Not in my house, folks. I wouldn't even say Beetlejuice 3 times. However, I do love the lore. I do love the idea of learning where this stuff comes from. And I think that the RPG industry as a whole is richer with this kind of knowledge. So that is my thoughts on black magic. There's certain things that you will never get past the threshold in my home. So don't even try, folks. I don't want it. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on black magic?
My real final thought is that I still can't get over the fact that Gygax didn't put the Goetia in Appendix N. It's such like an obvious key work. It seems like such a strange sort of oversight on his part. Possibly tactical, but
only Gygax and whatever deity he subscribed to knows that for sure.
But definitely, if nothing else, Google Louis Le Breton and check out his illustrations for Colin de Plancie's dictionary Infernal. Those are sort of the images that spring from the Goetia and kind of have invaded our brains. You will recognize a whole bunch of them, and they're super cool. And like, I don't know, there's a D&D-ness to them that I think that most people will immediately recognize and appreciate.
Very cool. Well, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the 3rd edition of the Dictionary Infernal, so I can't post it. But someday, you never know, if I ever have a couple $1,000 and one shows up on eBay.
Well, there you go, folks. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram, John McGuire RPG. I'm actually promoting things more because I was going to promote my book, Rocket to Russia, the first adventure for 3-2-1 actions, available now on Exalted Funeral. It is a rule set. There's monsters in there. Everything you need to play the game, including a full adventure. Check it out over at Exalted Funeral, Rocket to Russia. Folks, if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, think about becoming a patron over on patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We have a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at my RPG 3-2-1 action. We've got a behind-the-scenes look that is awesome at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points, that you definitely don't want to miss. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.